It's so great that everyone's here, and thank you. And Sarah Rosensweet is an incredible parenting coach that uses the peaceful parenting framework. And especially in the last year with pandemic parenting, what a better time to draw on the tools and the teachings of this framework. So thank you for coming. And I think, you've sort of already situated us at the heart of the first question I've had is, you're talking about sheltering in place and what this year has been. And for a lot of people, it's been, whether they're parents of young children, teenagers, whether they are looking after their own parents, whether they have fur babies. I think for anyone in a caregiving role in the last year, it's been tough, right? We've been asked a lot of been asked of us. So I'm really curious what you have seen in your practice as a parenting coach in the last year.
Well, a couple things stand out to me, Maya. One is that as human beings, we're wired for connection. And it's been, I think that of course we have, the people in our households that we can still connect with. But I think that, the studies show that the more casual social contacts you have, the happier you are. So I think that we've been missing out on some of that, time with friends. It's been tough, even if we've had our families that are with us. And I think the second thing is that we aren't meant to parent in a bubble, right? We aren't meant to parent in a bubble. We all need support. And really, there was a great article, I think 2 years ago in the Atlantic, that said the nuclear family experiment was a fail. Basically, we need our supports, right? We need whether it's extended family or whether it's our daycare people or whether it's, neighbors and friends. It's so hard to do this alone.
Mm-hmm. And now we've been asked in the last year, sort of depending on where you're situated and, in different stops and starts as there have been different waves of the pandemic. But that's exactly what we've been asked to do is as parents, try and find a way to help our children thrive in a bubble. Mm-hmm. And so I'm really curious, for those who might be new to it, what is peaceful parenting and why is it particularly helpful during pandemic parenting?
Sure. So 3 big ideas of peaceful parenting. Mm-hmm. The first is a focus on self-regulation, which means it doesn't mean that you never get upset with your kids, because that's, we're human, right? There's no parent on earth. The most peaceful parent in the world still gets upset sometimes. But what it does mean is that we learn how to calm ourselves so that we don't take it out on our kids, right? Mm-hmm. With yelling or worse. So a focus on learning when we get triggered, what we can do to bring ourselves back to, a calm state, like a green zone. That's the first big idea. The second big idea, and we always start there, that's the place to start, because any of the peaceful parenting tools or strategies, you can't really use them if you're triggered, right? Or if you're hijacked and not feeling calm. Mm-hmm. So that's the first big idea. The second big idea is that we focus on connection and the relationship. So again, that's what's been so challenging, right? The lack of connection with anyone outside of our bubble. But that connected relationship that you have with your child is the biggest way you have to influence them. And that's true for all relationships. If you don't feel like you've got a good relationship with your boss or your, mentors or teachers or whatever, you're not going to show up in the best way that you can for them. And same with our kids. Mm-hmm. And just a funny little story before I get to the third point, that has become so clear to me with having teenagers. Because with teenagers, as my son said to me when he was about 16, he said, "Mom, you don't understand. So many of my friends, don't tell their parents where they're going and they don't come home at night." And he said, "You're lucky that I care what you and dad think." And so it's that connection, it's that your kids caring what you think, that's how you can influence them, right? And really, when we can't control them anymore, not that we want to control them when they're young, but that can be a mainstay of a lot of parenting approaches, not our peaceful approach, but controlling kids through threats or rewards or punishments or whatever. So when you can't control them anymore, you want to be able to influence them. And if you haven't had that close connected relationship through their whole childhood, you're not going to be able to do that. So that's the second big idea is that connection. And then the third big idea is guiding them with kind, firm limits with no punishment. So it doesn't mean that kids are in charge or that they can do whatever they want. It means that when kids aren't meeting our expectations, first of all, we look at our expectations reasonable and age appropriate, because sometimes we just think our idea is the best, right? And it's not really that, that it's necessary, but we just like our own ideas a lot. So is our expectation reasonable and age appropriate? And if it is, how can we support our child to meet our expectation? Or how can we support them with empathy when, they can't eat the whole box of cookies or, stay up until midnight or whatever it is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's so interesting because the connection piece and the empathy with limits, they seem so connected, those two pieces, right?
Mm-hmm.
The empathy with limits, the limits with empathy just fosters the connection again, and sort of keeps feeding the connection. And so, within these times, like the pandemic period over the last year, at least here in Toronto, that doesn't really seem to have an end in sight. Why do you think peaceful parenting is particularly important or helpful when going through struggles? Yeah.
So all the challenges that we faced are going to be challenges to keeping ourselves calm, right? Like all of the extra stresses and burdens and not having the support. And when your resources are low, it can be really hard to stay calm with your kids, right? When they're pushing your buttons. So really having those skills of, how do I calm myself? And not only, I'm just going to say outside of peaceful parenting, how do I fill my own cup? Like, how do I make sure that I'm putting myself on the to-do list? And how do I make sure that I'm meeting my own needs? And I don't even like to call it self-care because I feel like that word has gotten sort of diluted a little bit. Like, where it's not about, bubble baths and going to the spa or whatever. It's like meeting your needs, literally, like, have I eaten enough? Have I slept enough? Have I gotten enough exercise? Am I getting time alone if I need that? Or, Zooming with girlfriends if it's social stuff that I'm missing. Like, what do I need so that I can fill the cups of my children, right? And so I think, and that's not specific to peaceful parenting, but I think between that and also really learning how to calm yourself, and it's definitely part of calming yourself, because if your needs are low, it's a lot harder to stay calm, right?
Yeah, for sure. My husband and I talk a lot about, if we have that period of time between when Dylan goes to bed and then we go to bed, how do we use that period in a way that makes us show up the next day the best we can as parents? So, really making what I feel, what I need during that time, those wise choices that I know will fill my cup. So what am I in control of? Well, I'm in control of how I use that period of time. And so for me, it's been, doing a lot of yoga nidra, which is like this deep breathing kind of central nervous system, putting it into that rest and digest mode, and then really holding myself accountable to going to bed early, because I parent so much more better, not in a judgmental way, but just in a way that feels so much more joyful when I've had enough sleep. And that's one of the few things I can control, is going to my go to bed time.
Yeah, it's really hard because I talk to a lot of parents. I'm like, okay, how's your sleep? And they're like, I stay up too late. That's the only time I get me time. But the thing is that if you go to bed earlier and you're more rested, then it's almost like, the me time doesn't feel quite as important because the days are not quite as long and torturous feeling. So I think that I love that you brought up the going to sleep. I'm not saying that nobody deserves me time after the kids go to bed, but maybe just a couple times a week you go to bed when your kid goes to bed, instead of staying up to, have that time. And I also love what you said about really being, what's the word I'm looking for? Intentional about that time, and trying to, instead of just like, oh, I got to do the dishes, like what's going to fill my soul for the next day, right?
Yes.
I've actually had to carve that out for myself because my kids go to bed after I go to bed. Well, not my youngest, but my other two do. So I have had to, maybe about a month ago, I just said, you know what? I'm going to take a bath every night. And it's been a little FOMO because I can hear people like laughing and doing things downstairs. And I'm like, oh, I kind of wish I was with the family, but then I'm always like, also like, I just need this time alone. So that has actually made a huge difference to me, just taking that time, taking an hour every night, reading, watching a show in the bath, like doing something, just taking that time away. And I'm also super clean now, so.
And then there's that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's good for you. Yeah, I can imagine that things shift, whether it's then, they sleep in and then we're back to, that me time in the early morning before they awake. I'll look forward to those years when that happens. We're not there. So if there's someone who's, new to peaceful parenting, what are some of the things that may come up for them as they're trying to learn about this approach and as they're trying to implement this in their own home?
Well, I think that sometimes there's a couple things that come up in the transition to peaceful parenting. One is that sometimes things get worse before they get better. And depending on what your parenting style has been like before, but if you've been using a lot of, threats and consequences, your kids might have a period where they're going to test you. Like, is she really not going to yell at me? Is he really not going to threaten me with a timeout when I do this thing? So sometimes kids can get a little bit testing, right? So there's that piece. Then there's also the fact that kids can have what we call a full emotional backpack in peaceful parenting, where your emotional backpack is a metaphor for your body. And it's where we carry around stresses, tensions, unprocessed feelings. And if your child if you've been using a lot of conventional parenting or punitive parenting, your child might have a store of kind of hurt feelings, right? I'm not shaming anyone, because all of those things come from, very, very traditional, advice. Like, oh, if your 2 years doing this, give them a timeout. Your pediatrician will tell you that. So, but that it's disruptive to the relationship and to the connection. So you might find that your kid you're not going to yell at them or punish them. So those are two things that might happen with your kids when you start using peaceful parenting. And you also might find that you start to when you're not yelling, when you're not going to, it's something I've got to do to them when they're being difficult. We start to recognize some of our old triggers that come up for us. Some common ones are, if your child's not listening to you, you might find that you have some, and they're usually rooted in childhood, feelings of that you don't matter, or that nobody listens to you, and that those get activated when your child doesn't listen to you. Or if you were raised in an authoritarian household and your child is being defiant, it might feel like an emergency to you, because when you were a child, if you had been defiant with your parents, it would have been an emergency, right? You might have gotten love withdrawal, or you might have gotten yelled at, or you might have gotten hit, right? If you were defiant with your parents. So sometimes, our kids can bring up either our own triggers or things that would have felt like an emergency for us when we were kids. So it's funny when I work with parents after 2 or 3 sessions, they always end up saying, this is really just about me. This isn't even about my kids at all. It's so funny. Sometimes we don't end up talking about the kids. We're just talking about, how do you feel when this happens? And it's really interesting. It's really an inner journey.
Yeah, I think I found in my, and I think we both connected in that, peaceful parenting was sort of the science-backed framework that sort of backed up what we were intuitively doing as parents when our children were born. But I think it's such a gift. My son holds up a mirror to everything in myself that's unhealed, and just daily provides me a chance to make a choice in everything I say, think, react, act, because, and I just think, wow, look at the generations of conditioning that we are breaking, and how amazing would this be for the next generation, right? And
there was a beautiful quote from somebody who took Dr. Laura's Peaceful Parents Happy Kids course, and this was a couple years ago. She was in the Facebook group, and she said that her son's birthday was the next day. He was turning 6, and for his birthday, she was giving him not only the transformer he wanted or whatever it was, but the gift of doing her own work on herself, so that she could give back to her ancestors what's theirs instead of passing it on to her son.
Wow! Oh, that just gave me goosebumps.
It made me cry when I've read it a number of times over the years, but the first couple times I read it definitely moved me to tears. But I just thought that was so beautiful.
That's beautiful, beautiful. And I see, and maybe sort of to close up, I see we have a really good question here, and the only. Speaking of, our children, my son is currently hunting for snails in the backyard. and it's pouring. So I have a feeling in a couple of minutes he might say, you know what, Mommy, my snail hunt is finished. So maybe to wrap up, someone's asked a question of, do you believe, Sarah, that it's important for both parents to have the same approach?
That's such a common question, and it's so unusual to have, well, not unusual. It's more common for one parent to be on board with peaceful parenting and the other one not yet. So what I always say to parents is kids need one person who's going to show up for them with empathy, connection, love, and I'm going to say the exception is if there's any abuse going on. We want to deal with that. We want to get help. But if it's like one parent's more into conventional parenting and still wants to use consequences or, whatever, you focus your energy on changing yourself and your relationship with your child and being as peaceful as possible. Don't focus your energy on trying to change your partner. It's not going to work. Often our partners will get shame triggered when we're saying they're doing it wrong, even if you're not saying literally wrong. But when we try to correct our partners, they will often feel like we're saying they're unworthy and unlovable, right? That's a shame trigger. And then they dig in their heels even more to prove why they're right and they're not, there's nothing wrong with what they're doing, because otherwise it's to accept that shame, right? So focus on your relationship with your partner, because as I said, we're kind of coming full circle here. The most influence you have over another person is through connection with them. So work on connecting with your partner. All of the peaceful parenting tools and philosophies are relationship strategies. So they apply to all of our relationships. I have a client who said, not only am I a better parent, she's a dentist. She said, I'm a better dentist because of peaceful parenting, right? So their relationship strategies, and focus on yourself, focus on your relationship with your partner. And it is, even if your partner never comes on board, you will have given your child the gift of showing up for them with empathy and love and connection.
Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been
You're welcome.
A pleasure to connect with you.
Is the snail hunt over?
It's over.
Yeah.
I wonder how many we found. Talk to you soon, Sarah.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.